Hello and welcome to the Better by Books channel. Today, I will interpret the crowd. I will spend about 30 minutes explaining its essence to you, the unique psychological characteristics that emerge when people gather into a crowd, and the impact of these characteristics on our social life. Speaking of the crowd, it is truly a very famous book. Its full title is The Crowd, a study of the popular mind. It is a pioneering work in the study of crowd psychology. For a long time, it has been regarded as a classic must-read in social psychology, enjoying a very high status. Before this book, people's understanding of the concept of the crowd was very vague, and crowds were not treated as a clear object of study. What makes this book remarkable is that it clearly proposed the concept of the crowd for the first time, and revealed the psychological characteristics of crowds for the first time. After this book, the concept of the crowd began to be taken seriously and finally became an important research subject. It is no exaggeration to say that all the theories, schools of thought, and practical methods related to crowd psychology and crowd behavior that we see today have developed from this book. This book proposes that when people share the same psychological demand, they may form a crowd. And once individuals form a crowd, they will exhibit psychological characteristics such as decline in intelligence, increased impulsiveness, and amplified self-confidence. The leader of a crowd must be a person with a strong will, someone capable of making assertions. Through continuous repetition of assertions and emotional contagion, the leader guides the crowd. The author of this book is Gustave Le Bon, a Frenchman. The Crowd was completed and published in 1895, which is already more than 120 years ago. Interestingly, Le Bon was a doctor of medicine and not a professional sociologist. However, his research interests were extremely broad, covering anthropology, sociology, social psychology, and natural sciences. The Crowd was actually a research work produced purely out of Le Bon's personal interest. At that time, French academic institutions did not take him seriously and did not value his work. But Le Bon persisted and eventually produced these pioneering and influential research results through his own efforts. After The Crowd was published, it successfully opened up a brand new research field, crowd psychology. The book contains many brilliant insights and far-sighted observations, shining with wisdom. However, many people have always maintained skepticism and criticism toward Le Bon and this book. Some criticized his research as lacking rigor, accusing him of treating personal speculation as conclusions without strict academic proof. Others believed that Le Bon's attitude toward crowds was overly pessimistic. But interestingly, regardless of whether people call his ideas speculation or nonsense, many historical events that occurred afterward confirmed his conclusions about crowd psychology one by one. As a result, some people jokingly said that Le Bon's bad predictions all came true. In this sense, Le Bon almost seems like a prophet or a fortune teller. The key content of this book mainly includes 4 aspects. First, how Le Bon defines the concept of the crowd. Second, what psychological characteristics crowds possess according to Le Bon. Third, how crowds are formed and develop. Fourth, what characteristics crowd leaders have. Let us first look at how Le Bon defines the concept of the crowd. In other words, in his view, who can truly be considered the crowd. First of all, Le Bon clearly points out that a group of people gathered together does not necessarily constitute a crowd. For example, people passing through or strolling in a square may be numerous, but they do not form a crowd. Only when these people share the same psychological state can they become a crowd. What does this mean? Those people in the square may be in the same physical space at the same time, but each person has their own focus, and there is no unified psychological demand. Therefore, they do not belong to what Le Bon defines as a crowd. However, if an earthquake suddenly occurs and someone shouts, "Earthquake, run to open ground," the situation immediately changes. At that moment, because everyone shares the same psychological desire for survival and self-protection, these people instantly become a crowd as defined by Le Bon. Le Bon also specifically points out that a crowd does not necessarily have to gather in the same place at the same time. Once psychological unity is formed, people scattered across society even if they do not meet face to face and do not know each other, can still form a crowd and display the psychological characteristics of crowds. A typical example is stock investors. They come from all walks of life and are scattered throughout society. Most of them do not know each other. But because they all share the same desire to make money through stock trading, they belong to a crowd as defined by Le Bon. Although Le Bon does not explicitly define this point in the book, it must be emphasized that strictly organized groups, such as soldiers, corporate employees, or students, do not belong to this type of crowd. These highly organized groups follow clear rules, accept strict management, and act under explicit command. They do not possess the psychological characteristics of crowds described by Le Bon. Of course, this does not exclude the possibility that individuals within these organizations may belong to other crowds. For example, a securities company is a strictly managed organization, and its employees at work are not part of a crowd. However, in their spare time, they may participate in pyramid schemes and instantly become part of a crowd. The above is the first key point of this book. What exactly is the concept of the crowd, according to Le Bon? Next, I will explain to you what collective psychological characteristics crowds possess in Le Bon's view. In other words, once people gather and form a crowd, how does their behavior differ from that of individuals? Le Bon summarizes three main characteristics in this book. First, decline of intelligence. The first characteristic concerns the decline of intelligence in crowds. When many individuals gather into a crowd, does the intelligence of the crowd become the sum of individual intelligence? Does it become smarter? In other words, is it really true that there is strength in numbers? Le Bon's answer is no, the opposite is true. He believes that the intelligence of a crowd is lower than the average intelligence level of its members. Even more unfortunately, the intelligence level of a crowd is largely determined by the least intelligent person within the group. Once many people gather together, their thinking often becomes irrational, simplistic, lacking in common sense and logic, and sometimes even foolish. To support this point, Le Bon provides several examples. Crowds are only willing to accept simple and clear slogans and claims. They are not interested in evidence or reasoning, and they do not engage in analysis or judgment. The more a simple claim caters to the basic needs of the crowd, the more likely it is to gain widespread support. Because of the decline in intelligence, crowds are especially susceptible to suggestion. They easily believe and spread absurd rumors and accept strange and irrational ideas. Second, exaggerated self-confidence. The second psychological characteristic summarized by Le Bon is extreme self-confidence, daring to think and daring to act, charging forward recklessly. As individuals, many bold or reckless actions are things people might only think about, or may not even dare to think about at all. But once individuals gather into a crowd, they not only dare to think about such actions, they also dare to carry them out, sometimes with a feeling of being above the law. This characteristic exists for two reasons. First, crowds have strength in numbers. Goals that individuals cannot achieve alone can often be easily achieved once collective power is concentrated. Second, after individuals merge into a crowd, their fear of punishment is weakened or even eliminated. In other words, people feel that they no longer need to bear responsibility for their actions. As the saying goes, the law does not punish the masses. Either no punishment will occur, or even if there is punishment, it will be shared by many people, so no one feels afraid. Third, emotional, sensitive, and action-oriented. The third psychological characteristic of crowds is that they are emotional, sensitive, and eager to take action. The formation and development of crowds rely on emotional contagion. Crowds are always driven by emotion, and the more intense the emotion, the more likely it is to become the dominant force. Driven by increasingly intense emotions, crowds tend to take immediate action rather than merely talk. As a result, once people gather into a crowd, they often resemble a powder keg, easy to ignite and quick to explode. At the slightest disturbance, violent action can easily occur. Looking at these psychological characteristics summarized by Le Bon, declining intelligence, increased confidence, and intense emotion. He therefore compares crowds to women, children, and barbarians. By this, he meant that they act not through rational thinking, but through instinctive impulses. This comparison angered many people. Later generations criticized this view as discriminatory, accusing it of sexism and prejudice against women and children, and it has been repeatedly attacked ever since. Historical background of Le Bon's thinking. Le Bon's intense focus on crowds is closely related to the era in which he lived. The French Revolution and Napoleon completely transformed France. Traditional feudal monarchy and religious authority lost their sacred status, and the power of the masses erupted with tremendous force. Mass movements, street protests, parliamentary elections, and even fashion trends increasingly came to be determined by ordinary people. Observing the rise of mass power, Le Bon felt deeply worried. He foresaw that in future societies, crowds formed by ordinary people would play a dominant role. Le Bon studied crowd psychology and behavior in order to predict future social development. The irrationality, impulsiveness, and recklessness he identified led him to adopt a pessimistic view of the future. The above explains the psychological characteristics of crowds proposed by Le Bon. Low intelligence, high confidence, and emotional intensity. How crowds are formed and develop. Next, I will explain how crowds are formed and how they evolve. Le Bon believes that crowd formation is influenced by two types of factors: indirect factors and direct factors. Indirect factors refer to the long-term infiltration of ideas and beliefs, which gradually change people's thinking over an extended period of time. The example Le Bon gives is the French Revolution. Ideas such as liberty, equality, and fraternity circulated in French society for hundreds of years, gradually being accepted by all social classes and laying a long-term foundation for the eventual outbreak of the revolution. Direct factors are sudden events that trigger crowd emotions, what we commonly call a spark or fuse. Once this fuse is lit, people scattered throughout society suddenly experience the same emotions and achieve psychological unity. Under the leadership of crowd leaders, the crowd can be rapidly mobilized and eventually take large-scale action. The storming of the Bastille, a symbolic event of the French Revolution, can be seen as such a trigger. It awakened revolutionary emotions among the French people and quickly evolved into a mass movement that overthrew royal rule. Under the long-term influence of indirect factors and the instant triggering of direct factors, crowds are formed. Interestingly, at the beginning, crowds are mobilized under simple and clear slogans. Their goals appear very clear. However, because these slogans are difficult to define precisely, the final outcomes often deviate greatly from the original intentions. In other words, crowds move toward a seemingly clear goal, but the result often goes off course. For example, consider football hooliganism. Fans gather to support their teams and hope for victory. But after the match, conflicts between opposing fans can quickly escalate into violence. In the end, the match result becomes irrelevant, while the fighting itself becomes the final outcome. Moral neutrality of crowds. Although Le Bon is highly critical and skeptical of crowds, he objectively points out that crowd behavior cannot be judged simply as good or evil. A mobilized crowd may engage in bloody violence in one moment and selflessly sacrifice to save a child's life in the next. Thus, crowds themselves are neither right nor wrong. They are simply easy to guide and immensely powerful. The key issue is where the crowd leader leads them. Crowd leaders. This leads to the final key topic, crowd leaders. Le Bon divides leaders into two types, short-term leaders and long-term leaders. Short-term leaders. Short-term leaders can guide crowds to take immediate action. Examples include leaders of riots, civilians who organize rescue efforts, influential online figures who shape public opinion, and idol stars who attract millions of devoted followers. The defining trait of short-term leaders is that, in difficult situations, they appear more determined, fanatical, and self-sacrificing than others. Their actions directly inspire imitation and followership. However, once the specific situation disappears, These leaders quickly lose their aura and return to being ordinary people, sometimes revealing even more weaknesses. Long-term leaders. Long-term leaders are rare, but their influence is enormous and can persist even after death. Le Bon uses Napoleon as an example. Napoleon's heroic image continued to grow after his death, even helping his otherwise mediocre nephew ascend the throne. Such leaders are often revered almost like saints, and their influence can take on a religious quality. The essential quality of leaders. Le Bon believes that to become a long-term leader, extraordinary willpower is essential. Such individuals must remain unwavering in their beliefs over long periods, regardless of circumstances or setbacks. They are not merely people who refuse to turn back before hitting a wall, but people who continue forward even after hitting the wall, determined to break through it. This unbreakable will is the key to maintaining and leading a crowd. How leaders mobilize crowds. Le Bon summarizes 3 techniques used by leaders. 1. Assertion. Leaders must present claims in the form of clear, decisive assertions, simple, vivid, and without evidence or reasoning, but aligned with the hopes of the crowd. 2. Repetition. Assertions must be repeated again and again. Repetition embeds ideas into the subconscious, making people believe them unconsciously. When the right conditions appear, people act automatically without analysis or judgment. 3. Contagion. Leaders must rely on strong emotions to infect followers, who then spread those emotions to others. Fear and anger are the most easily transmitted emotions. When assertions are wrapped in fear or anger, crowds accept them unquestioningly and act accordingly. Final review. At this point, the core content of the crowd has largely been covered. First, we explained Le Bon's definition of a crowd: a group united by psychological consistency. Second, we discussed the 3 psychological traits of crowds: low intelligence, extreme confidence, and emotional impulsiveness. Third, we examined how crowds form and develop through indirect and direct factors. Finally, we analyzed the role of leaders and how they mobilize crowds through assertion, repetition, and emotional contagion. Ongoing debates. There have always been interesting debates surrounding this book. Many scholars argue that Le Bon's conclusions are extreme and lack rigorous reasoning or solid empirical evidence. Some believe that because Le Bon was an amateur scholar, he raised sharp and insightful questions but lacked scientific methodology. There is also an intriguing speculation. Some suggest that Le Bon wrote this book as an experiment to test whether his own theories of influence truly worked. Looking back, the book itself is full of assertions, repetition, and emotional appeal. More than a century later, despite continuous criticism, the crowd remains a milestone in social psychology. If this speculation is correct, then perhaps Le Bon's experiment truly succeeded.